Welcome everyone. Welcome to Mike Fave YouTube. Today I want to dive into the 6 major roadblocks that people run into when they are transitioning from a low carbohydrate, keto, or carnivore diet into adding in carbohydrates. Now, whether that's bioenergetic or not, or just adding in carbs overall, these roadblocks still apply. The first major roadblock that people run into are FODMAPs. And this is something that I talked about in the recent video where I discussed Dr. Sean Baker's introduction of carbs into his diet via apples. Now, FODMAPs are fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And what they are is they are a type of carbohydrate found within fruits, vegetables, and a variety of other different types of plant foods that we can't digest. Our enzymes cannot break them down. So what winds up happening is they go into the colon, or if you have an overgrowth in your small intestine, they feed that overgrowth in the small intestine. And then the bacteria there get a hold of them. They convert them into a bunch of different metabolites. It can cause bloating, can cause gas, they can cause diarrhea, they can worsen constipation. And this is all dependent upon the different microbiome structure that you have present. And so for a lot of people, if you're coming from a diet that's pretty low fiber, pretty low residue, and doesn't really have a lot of fermentable substrate, and you start to try to add in carbohydrates and you start to add in this substrate, then you will start to find that you can get bloating, gas, digestive symptoms. And I've seen a lot of people say, oh, I can't tolerate carbs, I'm just going to go back to low carb or keto, even though they're dealing with these specific problems, whether that's hormonal problems, whether that's dealing with different recovery issues, sleep issues, mood issues from low carb, from keto, from carnivore, etc. And they're like, well, they're kind of in limbo. What do I do now? And basically what you have to do is you want to choose carbohydrate sources that are not high in these FODMAPs, that are not going to be causing these digestive issues. A caveat here is that not everybody has a problem with all FODMAPs. Some people don't do well with certain FODMAPs. And I've seen this time and time again with the clients that I work with and for myself. So I can eat cruciferous vegetables, even if well cooked, whatever the thing is, without having much problem. However, I have quite a bit of issues with things like onions, with things like garlic, etc. So it really comes down person to person. But when you are starting to add carbohydrates back in, you want to stay away from the FODMAPs and shift more towards the low FODMAP options. These are things like citrus fruits. These are things like pineapple. These are things like berries. These are things like white rice, white potatoes. So there's a variety of different options. Now, the next major roadblock that I see on a regular basis working with clients and also just see with people who are trying to transition out of low carb is their carb sources are not one-to-one glucose to fructose. So inside the intestine, the fructose cannot be absorbed in large quantities without glucose. So if you have a food, say an apple, and you eat them in high enough quantities, you wind up getting an excessive amount of fructose in relation to glucose, and then that fructose will not be pulled across the intestine because the intestine requires glucose to pull excessive amounts of fructose across. And what winds up happening is the fructose stays in the intestinal lumen, and then the bacteria start to ferment the fructose, produce a bunch of metabolites. Now you have bloating, you have gas, and in some of the studies, you start to see endotoxemia from that. So we don't want to be having carb sources that are not one-to-one glucose to fructose. And an easy way to solve this is, number one, choose the correct carb sources. But number two is if you're having some foods that are higher in fructose relative to glucose, you can balance them out with some starch sources that are pure glucose or something like dextrose. Now, I wouldn't go the dextrose route for everything because you don't have the micronutrient density with the vitamins and minerals or something like that. It's basically just sugar, just like plain table sugar. So I would go more towards starch sources. So if you're having problems with honey, you could do a little bit of honey with rice or have potatoes inside the meal that you're having some of the honey, and that may help to solve some of those issues. Now, the next roadblock that I tend to see, particularly keto and carnivore people, is that while they were on keto and carnivore, they had developed gut dysbiosis. Now, what causes this gut dysbiosis? The high amount of fatty acids going into the intestine and triggering bile acid release can lead to the leaking of these things or the not full absorption of these things, so they're getting into the colon. The bile acids, fatty acids are able to get out of the small intestine, make their way into the colon, and then the bile acids trigger irritation to the colonic epithelium, which triggers the serotonin release, And then also it can cause a dysbiosis in the microbiome because the bile acids can be utilized by different bacteria like hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, and that can cause a variety of symptoms. The other thing is with carnivore, when you're throwing in a bunch of amino acids into the colon, while your digestion initially gets better because you have a low residue diet, you don't have all these fibers, some of these irritating legumes and grains and things like this, so you start to feel less bloated. But over time, what winds up happening is when you throw that protein into the colon, the bacteria are able to ferment the amino acids and different components of the protein and create toxic metabolites that can create a variety of issues and also lead to dysbiosis in the long term. If you are dealing with a dysbiosis, you want to shoot for carb sources in the beginning that are very easily digestible, and then start with fiber sources that are not heavily fermentable and slowly add and expand the fiber sources that you can tolerate over time, kind of like if you were a child, again, a baby, and you're starting to introduce new foods. So maybe you want to stick with some juices, maybe you want to stick with some easily digested fruits, or you want to cook some of them. So if you have bananas or if you have berries or something like that and you're having a hard time, maybe cook them a little bit. That may improve your ability to actually tolerate them and absorb the nutrients and carbohydrate from them. And then you also want to be choosing fiber sources like carrots or squashes that are less fermentable to some extent inside the colon than something like broccoli or something like yams. Now, the fourth big roadblock that I tend to see with people who are transitioning from a low carbohydrate diet into adding in more carbs is insulin resistance. Now, I don't mean pathologic insulin resistance, which is what you would see with obesity or diabetes. These are people, or it may possibly you, who have been on a high-fat diet over an extended period of time. And what a lot of people don't understand, because the influencers inside the low carb spheres try to talk about a low carb diet, high fat diet leads to increased insulin sensitivity. Just because insulin levels are low, that tends to be the general idea. It's like, well, my insulin's low, my A1C is improved, all this type of stuff, so my insulin sensitivity is improved. Actually, not the case. When you are oxidizing primarily fatty acids as a fuel, which you are doing on a low carb, high fat diet, you are peripherally insulin resistant because when the cells are burning fatty acids, they will be unable to effectively burn carbohydrates. This is what's known as the Randle cycle. Now, this is a normal process. This is supposed to occur, so it's basically a saving mechanism for the fuel sources that the body has in times of starvation or in times of inadequate carbohydrate availability. The rest of the body shifts towards burning fats so that the carbs are spared for the central nervous system. And so what winds up happening is as you slowly start to add carbs in again, this will shift, especially as you start to lower fats. But with this circumstance, if you're dealing with blood sugar swings, if you're getting brain foggy, if you're getting ringing in your ears, or you're getting mood shifts when you start to add in carbohydrates, what you have to do, you have to slowly add carbs in. You're probably going to want to shift towards sources that are higher in fibers and whatnot, or at least not rapidly digesting sources like juices and honey and maple syrup. And you're going to want to have them in the context of a meal with fats, with proteins, with the fibers, so that you can delay the absorption a little bit and the digestion of the carbohydrates. So you don't have this rapid influx of carbohydrates right into the bloodstream with each meal, and you get the roller coaster afterwards. Now, as you become more insulin sensitive, this is much less of a problem. But in the beginning, you can kind of feel a little bit off when you're adding in carbs and you are physiologically insulin resistant coming from that high fat, low carbohydrate background. Now, the fifth roadblock that I tend to see is the shifting and transition of the metabolic and hormonal profile. So when you're oxidizing fats, as I mentioned, what winds up happening is you get into a state of physiologic insulin resistance. The insulin levels are actually quite low, and then this has an effect on other hormones like your thyroid hormone, like the gonadal hormones. And so what winds up happening is you lower gonadal hormones, you lower thyroid hormone, you raise the adaptive hormones, the stress hormones like the glucocorticoids, or you increase the sensitivity to these things, or you lower the thresholds for activating these things like the catecholamines. And what happens is there has to be a transition when you add carbohydrates back in, where the system shifts back over, lowers some of these stress hormones, these adaptive hormones, and you start to see changes in thyroid function, gonadal hormones, etc. And sometimes this transition can get a little bit rocky, depending on how long you've been in a low carbohydrate state. So with this in mind, you want to take it slow with adding in the carbs. You want to slowly dial down the fats. You don't want to go too low on the fats. There's problems with that when that occurs. And you want to also make sure that you're avoiding blood sugar dips and roller coasters and rushes that you can get if you don't structure or use the right types of carbs if you're dealing with this transition. Now, the last major roadblock is appetite shifts. So when you're on a high-fat, low-carb diet, you can eat a bunch of steak and eggs and butter all in one meal, and you get this huge bolus of protein and this huge bolus of fat. Now, protein is extremely satiating, particularly from meats, and then the fat slows gastric emptying down very, very significantly. So what winds up happening is you're full for long periods of time. You can go 5, 6, 7 hours without eating because you just smash the steak and a bunch of butter and egg yolks and whatever else. And when you start to lower the fat content and you start to dial the protein content into the optimal range at 0.82 grams per pound, then what winds up happening is you're actually going to start to be hungrier sooner because you don't have this very slow gastric emptying rate, and you don't have this increased satiety from the protein. So when you start to add in carbs, lower fat, the other thing is the carbs will start to increase the metabolic function again, upregulate thyroid hormone function, all these different components, and then it'll also go a ways to increase appetite. So that's something to keep in mind, that you're not going to go 5, 6, 7, 8 hours without meals. You're probably going to get hungry every 3 or 4 hours, depending on how you actually have the meal set up. And the other thing is, if you're insulin resistant when you start, there is that transition to becoming insulin sensitive again when you start to add in carbohydrates and lower that fat intake. And then that also, once you get to that point, you'll be able to go longer and you'll stretch the carbs out a little bit more, versus when you're just coming off the diet, you're used to that fat and that protein, and you're not hungry for long periods of time. You can find, oh wow, I'm getting hungry pretty quick. So I hope you like this video. If you want any other types of videos like this, or you have other recommendations, please drop them in the comments below, and I'll catch you in the next video.